if value is what determines the facts, different values, different facts. And now you know where the idea of alternative truth comes from. This is not something that only Trump or certain people on the right or left give us. This is the world we live in that tells us that it is the world view that determines the furniture of the world and the facts. Have a different world view and you're going to have different facts. And therefore the problem of objectivity in our postmodern world is first broached by Nietzsche, first opened up for us by him. And that is why a modern philosopher of education like Dewey defined truth not in terms of what's out there and whether ideas correspond to what's out there or not. What's out there is what we determine through our evaluations, through our subjective way of inquiring about the nature of reality. And so Dewey thus boldly said that what the truth is just what everyone else lets you get away with. So now we were left with the question, if existence isn't this striving to live or exist, but it's a striving towards something else, what is it? And we saw that all that striving presupposes values that choose the future over the present and therefore have a standard of comparison. Nietzsche wants to argue that that standard itself cannot be objective. Why not? Well, think about it in this way. If there was this objective standard, as Aristotle thought in Boethius, then there would be something it is to be human, right? This thing called human nature. And what it is to be human would therefore be the standard for being a good human or a bad human. And thus there would be this unchanging nature of humanity. Thus, if there was objective value, then there would be eternal values. There would be this eternal standard, and this would be how we would judge the change in things. Is it getting closer to the standard, or is it going farther away? Are things going downhill, as many of the older generation think, oh, in the good old days, things were better, and now it's all going to pot? Or are we more like the youth generation that says, no, we didn't start the fire. It was always burning, but we're going to be the ones who put it out. And so thus the future is progressing. And Nietzsche says, look, if we agree with Schopenhauer that everything is changing, not just our bodies, but our essences are changing. We are going to future states. We are constantly going to new states of being. Then what does that mean is what it means to be us changes, doesn't it? Therefore, what it is to be human now is very different, you would argue, than what it meant to be human in Aristotle's time or in Boethius's time. And if that's the case, then don't the standards change? If what it is to be human is constantly changing, then what is good for us is constantly changing, and we know this. When we test a medication, we know that we truly haven't tested it unless we've tested it on different age groups. Because what's good for a 4-year-old is very different than what's going to be good for an adult. And what is good for a good life practice for a 4-year-old is not a good life practice for an adult. My son is a case in point. When he was 4, I didn't let him touch the remote on the TV. Why? Because he tended to have all gooky stuff on his hands from putting them in his mouth and eating things that he shouldn't have put in his mouth. And that gooky stuff, if he touched the remote control, would get that remote control all gooky and pass germs and all sorts of disgusting things like that. And so therefore I set a rule for him that was good for him and for the rest of us: don't touch the remote. But now he's 25. Imagine I kept that same standard and said, oh, as a 25-year-old, it's not good for you to touch the remote. And he doesn't touch the remote because his parents don't allow him. There's something sick about that, isn't there? Perverted. He has changed. Therefore, what is good for him has changed. So therefore, since everything is constantly changing, it follows that there can be no objective standard for what is good, because if things change, what is good for them changes. But then we saw that it's our values that are presupposed in our very striving for things. And therefore, if there is no objective value, then it follows that it's subjective, that it's created, that we create our values. That's very important, because I want you to think about the nature of value itself. I'm not talking about what you like or enjoy, because there are many things that we call guilty pleasures. These are things that we like, but we don't value. In fact, we have contempt for ourselves many times that we enjoy that. Maybe, for example, if you're a very healthy person, you really, for example, do not have a great respect for candy. You wish that you hated candy and that you never had a sweet tooth, but you love sweets. So what you love and what you value are two different things. You value healthy food and you want to enjoy healthy food, but that's not always the case. And so we're not talking about things like, oh, I like strawberry ice cream, but you don't. And therefore, what I personally like, I don't expect everyone else to like. No, we're talking about the basis for what we admire and respect, the basis for our moral values. These kinds of values, which set our goals for the kind of person you want to become, and therefore set the value and worth of our existence, Nietzsche argued we must universalize. Well, think about it. Say, for example, you are someone who is a singer and you love singing and you started your own rock and roll band. Well, then what are you going to admire? You're going to admire those who do well in the thing you love, that you value. And therefore, who are your heroes going to be? They're going to be the great rock stars, the present great rock stars, those who have those skills that you admire. And so therefore, the basis for your admiration or contempt of other people will be your value system, won't you? And the whole world, everybody in the world that you meet with will be judged by the standard of what you think makes for a great person for yourself and for others. And if you think, well, yeah, but I don't have a firm standard, I think that's good for me, but it's not good for him. Well, then what you've done is you've set a permissible range of types, don't you? You're going to have contempt on people who are intolerant, aren't you? You are not going to tolerate intolerance. And what does that show you? That it shows you that you do have values that you universalize. You universalize permissiveness and tolerance. And thus at Salve, when we say we welcome people of all beliefs, don't believe it, Nietzsche says. If we welcome people of all beliefs, then we need to welcome those who are intolerant of any other belief but their own. And we don't. By saying we welcome people of all beliefs, what are we seeking to teach you? Nietzsche would say. We are seeking to teach you to not tolerate a society that is dogmatic and that does not allow a variety of beliefs in other areas. We are seeking to transform you, aren't we? And that's what we do with our values. We seek to transform the world into our value system. Moral standards are what are formed based on what we think is good for us, don't we? And we always universalize our moral standards. And you know this, because if you're driving on the highway and someone cuts you off without signaling and then slows down to make a left turn in the left-hand lane, which is the passing lane, how are you going to get angry at them? Why are you angry? Aren't their values different than yours? You're not going to care about that. You're going to say they should have done this, they should have done that. Your anger is a form of complaint that you feel you have a right to. We only get angry at those we believe are wrong. And we only believe things are wrong or right based on that standard of value. And so our moral standards, we always universalize. You might think, for example, that your sexual standards are very permissive. If somebody wants to wait till they're married, fine. But if someone wants to have multiple lovers, that's fine. As long as what? Now you notice that as long as it's not forced on them, as long as both parties are willing. Isn't that a standard? Aren't you going to demand, therefore, that the rapist or the molester be put away, that they be forced to conform to your value system? That's not objective. You created it. And so therefore, because we universalize our values, we always strive to set the law for everybody, don't we? When we fight against injustice, when we argue for racial and gender equality, aren't we arguing that those who disagree with us should be forced to conform to our image of the world? So therefore, the very process of striving presupposes values that we have set for ourselves, and not only for ourselves, but for the rest of the world, which means that we, by striving, are seeking to conform our environment, our world, to our value system. We seek to rule the world, don't we? In the very striving that undergirds our existence. Thus, Nietzsche argues that the will that undergirds all existence and drives it in its process of change is the will to power. It is the will to power that is behind all of your motivations. Again, don't get Nietzsche wrong. He's not saying, for example, that there aren't people who aren't trying to dominate people. That there aren't people who say, well, give power to everyone else, not myself. But he would say, there's a subtle problem if they don't think that's a striving for power. When I strive, for example, to take those out of power that have power and equalize power so that the powerless have as much power as I do, don't I need power to do that? Am I not using every means at my disposal, every power, to increase my power to equalize? In other words, an equalizing is a cutting down, isn't it? And that cutting down is something that I'm striving for. And therefore, if I'm striving for a true democracy, then I'm striving to found the state in my image, according to my values. And any nail that sticks up, I'm going to seek to hammer it down. So don't think that those who are unselfish aren't striving for power. What they're striving for is a world that's unselfish, and therefore they're striving to force the selfish to be unselfish. It's the nature of value to force, even if it doesn't use military force or overt means. There are plenty of forms of power. Don't be fooled by its various manifestations. The person who took Nietzsche seriously here was a guy named Max Weber. Max Weber wrote The Protestant Work Ethic, and in that book he founded the science. He was one of the founders of the science of sociology, and that science presupposes that all of existence is power structures. And therefore, when we understand the power structures that undergird individuals and societies, we understand society itself. Nietzsche and the will to power is the ground for all of this.